This is Michael David Cobb Bowen for Cobb Vision. Today's subject is gay marriage. Very difficult, a very different situation than it was perhaps a month ago. There's a couple things that I want to say in regard to this subject. And I think the most important thing to say right now is kind of a clarification of how my position changes now that Proposition 8 has passed. What I believe is that we are weakening our social institutions, and I am skeptical of activists on both sides because both sides contain rabble-rousers. And I am concerned, quite frankly, with the rapprochement between the actual gay couples and the public. And what I sense is that something that may be going on here will be tantamount to the social friction surrounding affirmative action, which is to say, at this point, the possibility is that any law that's passed that protects gay marriage in opposition to civil union will be taken as by defenders of traditional marriage as a degradation of marriage, as a countercultural injection of political activism into the public life, and a poisoning of politics. And I think the poison of politics is self-evident in the amount of rage that's expressed around this issue. But I want to give a simple kind of analogy or description that helps people understand where I, as a conservative, who not a social conservative, but a conservative in terms of the minimization of the state, sees the problem going forward. I think when I look at America and I listen to Dr. Laura and Dr. Ruth and Dr. Phil, I realize that there are millions and millions of Americans who have every reason to want to sustain a fulfilling relationship in their lives, and they're failing. We have churches, we have community centers, we have therapists, we have friends, we have neighbors, we have a whole industry in society that tries to help us understand each other, to communicate love, to live with love, and to stand in love. And it's all in our best interest to figure this out, and yet we don't. Now, in some corner of all of these millions of Americans are people, and I feel myself fortunate to count myself as one of those, who have a very good model, which I will just call holy matrimony right now. And the success of this model depends not only on the participants in it, but the understanding of people outside of it in terms of respecting it. And I would say something as bold as, to understand sex, you would have to understand premarital sex, and you would have to understand extramarital sex. And it is the concept of holy matrimony that determines our attitudes towards sex. And I think this model stands as an evolved position throughout all of human history, and is something worth defending. It is not, clearly, it is not the only way that people can love each other. But it is a particularly useful way, and I think societies have an interest in maintaining that model. Now, I think that there's a parallel to that model, or an analogy to that model, that might be found in the qualities of those relationships between same-sex couples in California who have been married. Which is to say, it is likely that the best aspects of holy matrimony, as I see it, can be found in some fraction of same-sex couples' relationships. And I believe that society, and in fact the state, has some interest in preserving that. And let's call that domestic tranquility. There is not just one way to domestic tranquility. There are multiple ways to domestic tranquility. But then I ask the question again as a conservative, if all the Dr. Ruths and all the Dr. Phils and all the Dr. Lauras and all the doctors can't get America to figure out a way to get into these models that we know work, what makes anyone think that passing a law is going to help? The passage of the law does not change the relationship of the love between myself and my wife. And it doesn't change the way I interact with my neighbors when they say to me, do this or don't do that because it may affect your marriage. It doesn't raise the level of understanding of my community or anybody I interact with to help me keep my good marriage. And I think the same thing applies to a good same-sex relationship. That there is no passage of a law that can do that. It is something that has to evolve over time in society. Now, down at the other end of the block, while people are throwing rocks at each other across the street, I hear the faint voices saying, Mike, I understand what you're saying, and marriage is a good thing, and we want it for same-sex couples. And I hear that voice. And I respect that voice. But I also know that getting into legislative battles in the aegis of the power of the state is not going to help. So I must be conservative. I must say, in light of the fact that some people are now protesting certain churches and attacking their social institutions' values in general. You see, everybody who is homosexual is not for gay marriage. And there are people who have a very difficult time, just like there are people listening to Dr. Phil and Dr. Laura, have a very difficult time reconciling their sexuality. So anyway, I hear the voices at the end of the block. And I'm trying to hear it through the noise of the political activism. And I am coming to believe that the political activism is more of a hindrance than a help. And my attitudes towards homosexuals hasn't changed at all. The law cannot change that. What has to change is an evolution in society. And I think we are making our society weaker and weakening our social institutions by trying to force this politically. The state can't do it. The state has an interest in seeing it done, but the state can't do it. And the state certainly cannot manipulate definitions of marriage. It cannot manipulate definitions of love. It cannot bring us closer to a mutual understanding. It cannot bring us closer to love. So please, stop being a political activist and turn and love your neighbor. This is Michael David Cobb Bowen for Cobb Vision. Peace.